Okay, my name is Hugh Farey. I'm the current editor of the British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter, and I'm a science teacher by trade. And after studying the Shroud for many years, I've come to the conclusion that on balance, I think it's more likely to be a 14th century forgery from a cloth that was made in the 14th century or just before than a 1st century cloth bearing the authentic image of Jesus Christ. And I say that in spite of the fact that I'm a Catholic and teach at a Catholic school. So people want to know what's made me tilt my decision in favour of the forgery instead of authenticity, for which there are some quite interesting, but to my mind not quite convincing arguments. The overwhelming consideration has got to be the carbon-14 dating that was done in 1988, in which a small piece of the shroud was chopped into three and given to three different science laboratories who came up with results that were within 100 years of each other. Now, in order for that to be wrong, and plenty of people have made huge attempts to try and show that the carbon dating could be wrong, you have to make so many assumptions about what could have gone wrong that I feel they're just not convincing. The fact of the carbon dating overrides the arguments against it, although I'm aware that there are arguments against it. The other thing is that the shroud itself is a piece of linen woven in an extraordinarily obscure manner. There are no examples of a piece of linen woven in that style from the 1st century, or indeed almost from any other century. There are tiny fragments from the 14th century. So what we have to look at is the kind of loom that was typical in 1st century Middle East, which only involved one heddle. Now, a heddle is the thing that lifts some of the threads above the other threads, so that you can pass a shuttle backwards and forwards, and thus producing woven cloth. Now, in the Middle Ages, certainly there were looms, and we have these looms, which have a number of heddles, so that you can lift different kinds of numbers of threads, different amounts of threads, different threads in different areas, and produce patterns on cloth. Now, we know that the Syrians did this, and Syria and places eastwards did this with silk. But there's no record of anybody doing it with linen, and it seems that almost all the linen recovered from 1st century Israel has been simple over and under cloth of the kind that one would make sheets with today. So although there are vanishingly few examples of the weave, it is far more typical, I would think, far more possible that it was done in the Middle Ages and in Northern Europe rather than Southern Europe. It was much more typical of people like the Scots and the Danes than of the Romans, the Turks, and the people of the Middle East. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that people have tried for a very long time to try and come up with possible ways in which the image may have appeared on the shroud. And all of them have failed. Certainly, all the ones depending on emanations of vapours from a dead body, and any one that depends on emanations of radiation from a dead body, have failed to produce any kind of realistic image. The only images that have come close, and even they haven't come very close, have been the ones which have relied on putting an image with a pigment onto the shroud and then washing the pigment off, leaving a stain or a corruption of the cellulose of the linen itself, which has been equivalent to a kind of chemical scorch. So that although at the moment there's nothing on the shroud that could be considered colouring material, there's no paint or pigment, there's no oils, spices, myrrh, nothing. It's pure cellulose, and that cellulose, though, is slightly degraded. So I think that the best effort to reproduce it so far has been Luigi Garlascelli's attempt, in which he painted a shroud in blue paint, mixed with a 1% solution of sulfuric acid amongst the medium to hold the blue paint. And then by rinsing all the blue paint off, was left with a faint image of his paint burnt into the cloth by the sulfuric acid. And that, I think, is the nearest we've got. And it'd be very easy for people to say, but it doesn't look very good. And the answer is, you're dead right, it doesn't look very good. It is, however, to my mind, the nearest we've got. And I think those three things, the carbon dating, the medieval loom, and the closest possible way of replicating the image that's been done so far, those are the ones that tilt me slowly in favour of thinking it's a forgery rather than authentic.